Mischief makers!
Hi everybody, what's up? Aaron here. Welcome to the inaugural video in what's going to be an open-ended series on video games. So these videos are not intended as comprehensive reviews, but rather just a chance to highlight one specific aspect of a game that I really like and that I think merits some discussion. Today I want to talk about one of my all-time favorite games, Mischief Makers, and its unique visual style. This obscure gem was released in 1997 for the Nintendo 64. The box art conjures the image of a rather generic-looking early polygonal platformer, but this description does not do the game justice at all. It's actually one of the neatest looking games that I've played, and one of the few games of its era that I think still holds up very well visually today. The in-game art for the main character, Marina Lightyears, is a fair bit better. It's a fun design. The peg legs and the visible robotic joints at the knees are a particularly nice touch. Her actual sprite has a nice bouncy quality, and the ribbons that flow from her hat convey her momentum and movements quite well. And yes, by the way, this game is indeed sprite-based for the most part, not polygonal, but more on that in a bit. Even more interesting is the design of the alien world on which the game is set. You'll immediately notice the peculiar faces which appear on all of the game's blocks, balls, and other architecture. Of course, faces on inanimate objects are nothing terribly original for platformer video games, but these faces are quite striking, with their hollow, glowing red eyes and gaping mouths. It's not just the architecture either. Virtually everything on the planet shares the same iconic face. This includes objects, plants, animals, and even the native humanoid species, the Clancers.
Yahoo!
Clancers are not merely inhuman monsters to be overcome either. They range from enemy to ally to everything in between. It makes for a bizarre, sort of expressionist aesthetic that gives the game a surreal and slightly unsettling atmosphere, despite its overtly cartoonish tone. And this atmosphere is only further enhanced by some of the Clancers' other peculiar tendencies. They have a habit of wailing, groveling, and when they're killed, they melt into the earth in a rather disturbing way and release a little specter. In addition to the visual design itself, there's a lot to be said about the particular way that style is realized as well. Despite being released on the N64, a system whose library almost exclusively featured 3D polygonal graphics, Mischief Makers is primarily 2D sprite-based, although it does make use of a few 3D assets in places, as well as some filter effects. I can't speak to whether this is specifically because of the N64's hardware or simple strong artistry, but the sprite work is quite nice. The extremely smooth shadows really make the visuals pop. Notice in particular the balls. And the use of color makes for some gorgeous backgrounds. Those backgrounds also make great use of parallax scrolling as well. For those unfamiliar, when moving side to side in a 3D space, objects in the background will appear to move at different speeds depending on their distance. 2D games are able to create a perception of depth by replicating this effect by scrolling multiple layers at different speeds as the player moves, and that's what you see here. Notice in this last level in particular that there are 4 different layers of background terrain. Also, there are 2 separate layers of clouds, and they scroll across the screen at different speeds, even while the player is stationary. It all combines to create a very lively background, and one of the most 3-dimensional looking 2D games that I've played. Okay, so we've talked about the backgrounds and the sprite work a bit, but we still need to have a look at Mischief Maker's most unique feature, the boss animations. At first glance, the bosses may look like they're created with traditional sprite animation, just like the smaller characters. But whereas the smaller characters consist of a single sprite with numerous frames to create the illusion of movement, the bosses are built much differently. They're actually made up of a variety of smaller but mostly static sprites. Those sprites are then rotated, repositioned, and relayered together to create the appearance of movement. Have a look at this toad, for example. Notice how, unlike Maria, its head, body, and each of the segments of its limbs are all separate, distinct pieces. And if you look at any one piece, the actual image remains mostly constant even as it hops around the screen. The frog only appears to hop as it travels because of the changing way those pieces are laid out. In this way, the animation being used is actually closer in style to cutout animation, as you see in some animated TV shows. Also, notice how much more detailed the boss is than Marina. That's the advantage of this style of animation. Animating sprites frame by frame is quite labor intensive. Dozens of frames, if not more, must be drawn manually for every unique action, and those frames must remain reasonably consistent to the others. Thus, there's a harsh practical limit to the amount of detail that a traditionally animated sprite can feature. However, since most of these bosses require only a single frame or two for each piece, the artist is free to pack in a ton more detail. That's where you get all these gorgeous little glossy highlights and the really smooth shadowing you see here. These are just some of the mini bosses too. Even nicer are some of the world boss fights against the so-called Beastector, a trio of animal men who ride on special battle vehicles. These make for some pretty great multi-stage boss fights. You start out fighting them on a vehicle of some sort, but once you do enough damage, their vehicles actually transform into these big beastly-looking robots. Let's see that one more time in slow motion. These whole sequences just look great. The cutout style animation makes these transformations feel super real. They don't just sort of fade or morph into something else with parts shrinking or expanding as needed. Instead, all of the same parts are still there. Most of the exact same static sprites are used, they're just rearranged and relayered in new and inventive ways to form something else. Plus, after they complete their transformations, they just look quite good in motion as well. They really sell the animal-like movements. The neatest part, though, has got to be toward the end of the game, when all three come together and combine into a giant robot. This is achieved using, again, almost the exact same sprites, simply reorganized. Now, Mischief Makers certainly isn't the only game to ever make use of this sort of cutout style animation. In fact, it's essentially the house style of modern developer Vanillaware, creators of such games as Odin's Sphere, Dragon's Crown, the upcoming 13 Sentinels, as well as a number of others. Although, personally, there's still something about Mischief Maker's particular look that I think I slightly prefer to these modern alternatives. Perhaps it's that, despite being much lower res, it's slightly less uncanny, although maybe it simply comes down to nostalgia talking as well. Also, there are certainly examples of older games prior to the 5th console generation using cutout style animation. Although I can't speak to any of these examples from personal first-hand experience. If you would like to bring up one such example, please feel free to post it in the comments below. In any case, that's all for me today. I hope you all keep an eye out for future videos. I believe this is where I'm required to ask you to like and subscribe. And now, at the risk of spoiling too much of this excellent game that you should absolutely play yourself given the opportunity, I'll leave you with this last boss fight.